All right, so let's dive right in. Today, we're looking at this case in India, and it's a really interesting one because it gets you thinking about, where's that line between speaking your mind and, maybe taking it too far, causing offense,
Mhm.
right? And this case, it involves Ranveer Allahabadia, who's like a big-time YouTuber over there. He got into some hot water with the Supreme Court over something he said on his show.
Yeah, this case is really fascinating, especially now when you see how everyone's trying to figure out this whole content moderation thing, on all these digital platforms. Like, how do you balance free speech with, being responsible when you have a huge audience hanging on your every word?
Exactly. And, for those who might not know Ranveer, he's got this podcast, India's Got Latent. He's kind of known for giving business advice, like
Ugh.
the whole. A real motivational speaker.
Yeah.
But this time, I guess you could say that motivation kind of backfired in a big way.
What happened was, well, there's this episode of his podcast where he makes some comments about parents and sex, and people just went off. They were calling it obscene, and it just blew up. It went from like online criticism to full-on legal action.
Yeah, and we're not talking just one or two complaints. I mean, multiple FIRs were filed against him, and not even just in one state, but across India, Maharashtra, Assam, Jaipur. It seems like this wasn't just like a few people being offended. This really struck a nerve on a, much larger scale.
It's interesting, though, because the details about exactly what he said, like the actual words, aren't really out there. But the fact that it led to all these FIRs in multiple states, I mean, that suggests that what he said could have, like, violated some serious Indian laws about obscenity and offensive speech.
And to add fuel to the fire, Ranveer starts getting death threats on top of everything else.
Yeah.
So now it's not just legal trouble, it's like a full-blown personal safety issue. And that's when things took a turn for the dramatic, really.
Definitely. The situation just keeps escalating because Ranveer, in the middle of all this, he tries to leave the country, right? But the Supreme Court actually denies his travel request, which, sends a pretty clear message that they're taking this seriously and they're not just going to let him avoid the consequences.
Wow, so it goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. What happens in the courtroom?
Well, let me tell you, things got pretty intense. Justice Surya Kant, he really grilled Ranveer's lawyer about what exactly is considered obscenity and, using offensive language, especially when you have such a massive platform like Ranveer does.
Yeah, because that's a whole other layer to this, right? It's not just what he said, but the fact that he said it to potentially millions of people.
Exactly. And that's where it starts to get really interesting because it raises all these questions about, like, where do you draw the line with free speech, especially in this digital age where anyone can reach a global audience. Justice Kant really seemed to be pushing back against this idea that just because you're popular, you can say whatever you want.
Right, so what did Justice Kant actually say? What was his take on all of this?
Well, he asked some pretty pointed questions like, what are the parameters of obscenity and vulgarity? If this isn't obscenity, then what is? Have you got a license to speak all kinds of languages? He even went as far as to ask, tell us, is there anyone in the world who would like such words?
Wow, that's pretty strong. It doesn't sound like he was pulling any punches.
No, not at all. And it suggests that the court was looking beyond just the legal side of things. They were considering the bigger picture, the impact that offensive language can have on society, especially when it comes from someone with a huge influence.
It's like they were sending a message, not just to Ranveer, but to all those content creators out there. Think before you speak, because words have power and there are consequences.
Right, it's like a cautionary tale, Just because you have a platform and millions of followers doesn't mean you're above the law, and it certainly doesn't protect you from the harm your words can cause.
So, okay, they make it clear they're not happy with Ranveer. But what happens next? I mean, do they just shut down his entire show? That seems a bit extreme.
It is interesting because the ruling wasn't as straightforward as you might think. They actually let Ranveer keep his show going. But there's a catch. They said he has to stick to standards of, like, decency and morality, which I think is really interesting because, well, what does that even mean? Who gets to decide what's decent and what's not?
So they didn't completely shut him down, but they definitely put him on a tight leash content-wise.
Yeah.
It sounds like they were trying to find a middle ground, right?
Yeah.
Like, how do you protect free speech but also protect people from content that could be harmful?
Yeah, exactly. And finding that balance, it's definitely not easy. The court said that yes, free speech is important, but it's not like a get out of jail free card. There are limits, especially when what you're saying could be seen as obscene or offensive.
And I guess this is where the tort's reasoning gets kind of tricky, right? They basically said that just because you're famous, and have tons of fans, it doesn't put you above the law. Like when it comes to what you can and can't say, everyone has to play by the same rules.
It's really interesting, though, how they focused on this idea of decency and morality. I mean, those are pretty vague terms, right? It makes you wonder who gets to decide what they actually mean and how those definitions are going to be applied in, different situations.
It makes you wonder if this whole thing is going to, like, scare other content creators in India into being more careful about what they say. Are we going to see a lot of self-censorship because people are worried about getting in trouble with the law?
That's a good question. And yeah, I think this case could definitely have a ripple effect on the whole content creation scene in India. Platforms like YouTube, they might feel the heat too. They might start getting stricter with their content rules to avoid getting caught up in similar legal battles.
But isn't there a risk of that going too far? Like, what if content creators get so afraid of crossing a line that they stop talking about anything controversial? And what if platforms start censoring things that aren't actually harmful, just to be on the safe side?
I see what you mean, and it definitely raises concerns about censorship. I think the key here is to have, like, clear guidelines and legal definitions, right? If the goal is to protect people from harmful content, we need to be specific about what exactly that means, without stifling creativity and open discussion.
Right, because it's a fine line. So, okay, what about Ranveer's travel request? Did the court ever let him leave the country in the end?
Nope, they stuck to their guns on that one. He had to stay put in India and deal with the legal process, which again shows how seriously they were taking this whole thing. They weren't going to let him just skip town and avoid the consequences.
This whole situation is definitely a wake-up call for anyone creating content online, isn't it? It shows that even in the digital world, there are real-world consequences for pushing the boundaries of free speech. It's not just about your reputation. It could actually land you in legal trouble.
Absolutely. And I think it also highlights the power of the Supreme Court. They can step in and regulate online content, and this case could set a precedent for how future cases involving online speech are handled. It'll be interesting to see what happens next.
So what does all of this mean for our listeners out there? This case might be happening in India, but the issues it brings up, they're relevant everywhere.
You're right. It really gets to the heart of how we deal with free speech in this digital age. Like, how do we balance individual rights with protecting people from harm? What role should these platforms play in controlling what's posted? These are questions everyone's struggling with, especially as our lives become more and more intertwined with the internet and social media.
It seems like this case has opened up a whole can of worms. And we're only just beginning to, like, untangle all the threads.
Totally. And it's going to be fascinating to see how this case impacts things like content moderation policies, how the law interprets free speech, and even how content creators approach their work moving forward.
It sounds like the online world is on the verge of some major changes.
It's possible, and this case could be what sets those changes in motion. It's a good reminder that even online, there are rules, there are responsibilities, and there are consequences for what you say and do. The internet isn't some kind of lawless Wild West.
So as we wrap up, I'm like, what are the big takeaways here? What should our listeners really remember about this whole Ranveer situation?
I think the main thing that jumps out, right, is how tricky it is to balance, saying what you want, that freedom, with being responsible for what you put out there, especially online. I mean, things can go viral so fast, millions of people see it in seconds. The potential for, like, causing harm is huge these days.
It's like, you're not just talking to your friends anymore. It's like you have this megaphone and suddenly everyone can hear you.
Yeah, exactly. And with that reach comes, well, responsibility, right? Got to think about the weight of your words. And the court's decision here, it sends a clear message, I think. Even online, there are limits. You can't just say anything because you're famous or have lots of followers. The law still applies, and there can be real consequences for putting out stuff that's harmful or offensive.
It's a reminder that just because you can say something doesn't always mean you should. Freedom always comes with responsibility, and that's especially true when you have a platform that gives you a voice, a way to reach so many people.
And the court kept bringing up this decency and morality thing, which, okay, those words can be kind of vague, right? But it seems like they're saying content creators have to think about the bigger picture. It's not just about your own self-expression. It's about the impact you might have on society as a whole.
It makes you wonder, though, what about other people making content online? How is this going to affect them? And what about those platforms like YouTube? Are they going to change how they do things because of this ruling?
Oh, yeah. I think a lot of content creators, especially in India, are going to be watching this case very closely. They might be more careful now about like pushing boundaries or talking about things that are controversial. And yeah, the platforms themselves, they might feel the pressure to, tighten up their content rules just to avoid getting into legal hot water.
But isn't there a risk of that, like swinging too far in the other direction? Could it end up stifling free speech if everyone's too scared to say anything that might offend someone?
That's a really good point. I think the solution is, well, we need clearer guidelines, right? More specific legal definitions. If we want to protect people from harmful content, we have to define exactly what that means without, shutting down open and honest discussion.
This whole thing in India, it really makes you think about this global conversation we're having, right? About freedom of speech, about responsibility online. It's not just about Ranveer. It's about all of us figuring out how to deal with these issues as technology keeps changing the way we talk to each other.
That's exactly it. And it's a conversation that needs everyone at the table, The people making the content, the platforms hosting it, the lawmakers, even just the regular people consuming it. We all have a part to play in making sure the online world is a space where people can speak their minds, but also where everyone feels safe and respected.
So to our listeners, we'll leave you with this. Think about how this case might change things, not just in India, but for everyone online. It's complicated, no easy answers, but it's something worth considering as we all move forward in this digital world.
Yeah, these are questions we're going to be wrestling with for a long time, I think. And the way we answer them, well, it's going to shape how we use the internet and how we relate to each other online for years to come.
And on that note, that's the end of our deep dive for today. We hope this has gotten you thinking about free speech, about responsibility, and about the power of these online platforms. Thanks for joining us, and until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those brains working.